everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I think we'll have a fun discussion today talking about top 10 challenges enterprises face with Power BI. I have a brief agenda today. We'll talk just quickly about the background of this list, how we created it, etc. And I will then go through those top 10 items that we've identified. They are in no particular order, so they're not in order of frequency or importance. So just know that as I get into it. And then we will get into questions. So this presentation today does not have any demonstrations or anything like that. So the agenda here is pretty brief. My name is Bob Rubocki. I am a practice manager and architect at Pragmatic Works. You can reach me here if you want to drop me an email. We'd love to talk with you about either feedback on this presentation or how you're managing your Power BI environment. And I did notice on one of the welcome slides that Adam Jorgensen's name was mentioned in there. Adam and I did work on this together, and we kind of tag teamed who would actually do the delivery here, and it's me today. So before I get into the list, just want to kind of lay the expectation of how should you use this list as you're listening today. And I kind of just broke our audience into two groups. And so if you're just getting started, you may want to use this list today as just some ideas. If you're getting started with Power BI, these are some things that you should consider. There'll be a little bit of guidance in here today, but this should be like a pretty good list, based on other similar organizations' experience that you can kind of use for guidance and things to think about as you roll out Power BI in your organization. But then if you're already using Power BI, which it seems like a lot of you are at some phase here, you can kind of check your experience against this list. And if you're nodding your head like, yep, I've seen that, then just know that that you're not alone. This is a top 10 list, so it means that a lot of these we've seen frequently. And so if this list is hitting home, you're not alone, and you're probably doing a lot of things just right. The other thing I want to mention about the list is that we will have some suggestions in here about how to address the challenges, but the focus today is really to kind of just kind of spell out from kind of like a market perspective what we're seeing, and not so much to really talk about specifically how to address each of them, although we'll sprinkle in bits today about how to address some of the challenges. So this list was created really from the collective experience of Pragmatic Works. So a lot of it is from the surveys that we do at the beginning of things like webinars. So your feedback that you just provided on that survey is really important to us as we shape our consulting offerings, as we design training materials, et cetera. And it also helps us with webinar content, quite frankly. We just want to make sure that our content is relevant. And so those surveys are really important, and that's part of where we got the list of challenges from. A lot of this also is just our experience with the consulting in the field. So we're doing a lot of implementation engagements with customers, a lot of readiness assessments, trying to help customers get ready to deploy in Power BI. And so some of the list was taken from experiences there. And then training as well. Pragmatic Works does a lot of training. We present training for customers. We develop training materials, courses. And so through the process of either delivering training or preparing training, we've gotten to understand a lot of what some of the common challenges are for enterprises. So to getting into the list, and this kind of resonated a little bit on the survey questions here as we opened. One of the big challenges is team readiness, and this can mean a variety of things. It's really the word team here can be very broad, but it certainly covers your developers or your report builders. Who's going to be building your reports? Who's going to be importing the data and scrubbing it and creating calculations? But it's also talking about the people that are going to be consuming the reports, your data consumers. How do they navigate the reports? How do they interact with reports? How do they provide feedback on reports? et cetera. So there's a lot that goes into helping those people get ready. And then also administration. For a lot of organizations, the way that this is administered is new, and it's different than other applications that they're using today. And so there's a lot of preparation that needs to go in from the administration standpoint to make sure your team is ready to deploy Power BI. There's also a big exercise of trying to find who is going to work in each of these roles. If you're new to Power BI, some of the work that's being done or is required, you may not have people or staff that are doing that today, so you kind of have to figure out who's going to be working in those roles, and that's the part of this too. There are a lot of online resources for training, and certainly Pragmatic Works has a lot of material for technical training, but this is the kind of thing that also really just from an organization level just requires a lot of coordination and planning to make sure that your team is ready to deploy Power BI. So really one of the biggest promises of Power BI, of course, is the advanced analytic capabilities, the rich visualizations, the interactivity. And for a lot of companies coming from, I have the green bar report illustration there, a lot of the report design paradigms are new. If you're coming from a world where most of your reports are what we called your data export reports, or reports that could be printed on a page that are relatively static. You have some filter capability, maybe some drill down. But when we're getting into Power BI, we've got all new considerations for how should we lay things out, how should the information flow on the page, how do we navigate, what types of visualizations are going to be most effective for communicating my data to my audience. This quickly gets into things like what kind of colors should I use, what kind of style should I adopt, as far as, even things like fonts and spacing and backgrounds, and there's just a load of different design features there. And so that can be quite challenging. For many organizations, the whole idea of mobile reporting, this would be the first time that we're introducing that, using Power BI, so there are considerations there for designing a report such that they're consumable on a mobile device. And then another thing that's interesting with Power BI is this idea of being able to use data to tell a story. And this is really a new concept for many organizations. Again, particularly if you're coming from a world of kind of the spreadsheet style reporting, that you can now use something like a dashboard or a report page to tell a story about how your organization is doing there. Now, on the design side of things, there are a lot of really great resources online. I don't have any specific recommendations other than to do some searches, and there are some really good resources online. Some good examples of things that people have done as far as how to lay out pages and how to navigate them, how to drill down, and things like that. So there is a lot of good information online there. The next one here I want to talk about is security management. And it looked like some of you had some challenges with this. This was probably not your biggest struggle in a lot of cases, but it's definitely a challenge, and I'd say particularly if you're just getting started. And when we're talking about security, it really means a lot of different things, and I've kind of highlighted some of those here. So it means everything from gaining access to the source data that's going to be used for reporting and how that's administered, what type of accounts are going to be used to access that data, where is that data. But then after we've rendered reports in that data, how do we control access to who can see the reports, who can create reports, who can edit reports, is another layer of security. And with Power BI, one of the, in addition to the visualizations, probably the next big promise of it is the ability and the ease with which we can share our reports with our peers in our organization. But there are some security concerns there and just things that you have to consider if you're going to allow sharing, who can share, who can you share it with, etc. And depending upon how you've got things configured, we'll talk about this a little bit more, one of the other challenges, you very often want to design your reports such that certain people can only see certain data. And so you want to make sure that when you're designing your reports that you've taken that into account to make sure that you've got the best security approach in place. Now I mentioned in the picture there, Azure Active Directory. Most successful security management practices are going to involve using Azure Active Directory. It's certainly for managing logins and identity, but then it just integrates very tightly with Power BI, and then depending upon your data sources, we can also use that to integrate with your data sources. And so just want to call that out as a suggestion that if we're talking about security, that I think that pretty quickly you will want to consider your Active Directory implementation. I do want to mention here also that it is really important to document all of your security requirements and make those available so people can see them, just so that there's no ambiguity around what's required for security. But it also makes sure that all of these levels of security and different securable items have been covered and considered when you're defining your approach. Another challenge that we see organizations have is dealing with license management. And so if you're just getting started with Power BI, this can be a little bit confusing, I guess would be the word, if you're just getting started. So there are oftentimes some challenges with managing licenses. And part of it is this idea that it's managed through Office 365, which in some cases is a different way of managing business software compared to what we might be used to coming from a different type of environment. And then there are also just different types of licenses. So you have your pro licenses and your premium and et cetera. And I don't want to go into all the details here, but the point is that it is a challenge, and it's something that needs to be addressed early on. License management is really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's security, but it's also cost management, right? So we have a little bit more, there are more options, I would say, with licensing and cost management with Power BI than maybe some other software packages that people use. And so it's just something that is a challenge for organizations that are particularly new to Power BI. So this one did resonate. I saw in the survey questions about standards and data governance. And to preface this, I am going to talk about compliance in a second. But the way that I think about standards and data governance, generally speaking, would be more for your internal audience. And so this is around things like, kind of the problem of multiple versions of the truth and which one is correct. And this is really a problem that's not limited to Power BI, but it's one that comes up as people are deploying Power BI. This idea of, I've got all this data out here, what data is the right data? And quite frankly, where organizations succeed with getting control of governance is by having a committee or a group of people that can come to an agreement on what those quote unquote correct data sources are. So this is something that's really a matter of communication and agreement at the organization level. It does generally include identifying people or application owners or subject matter experts or stakeholders that can certify that, yes, the data in this system is correct, and this is the data that should be used for reporting. And so this does come down to communication again, just so people are clear about which data sources do have the correct data. That's not to say that there are data sources in your organization that they might be valuable, but they might be valuable for a more specialized use case, and maybe just not, they might require more interpretation if they were distributed to a wider audience throughout the company. So thinking kind of at a company or organizational level, it is important to agree on what data is correct then. Another thing that's important is kind of having control over who and how that data is distributed within the company. So if I think about Power BI, this idea of being able to see and control who can actually publish reports that are even shareable within the organization. Otherwise, you can run into challenges with everybody has access to published reports, and now everybody's publishing things, and it can get kind of messy. And so creating processes that help streamline or simplify who can publish, how often things are published, et cetera, will go a long way to helping address that challenge. So as I mentioned here, talking about compliance, compliance definitely has, in most cases, more of an external impact. So we're talking about, outside organizations that your organizations may have to comply with. So things, like HIPAA or GDPR, entities that are outside of your organization that you have to answer to, essentially. But compliance certainly has a large internal aspect as well, similar to governance in that we want to understand who has access to certain data, et cetera. One of the big differences that I think of with compliance is that, particularly with Power BI, and we're in the cloud, and this is new for a lot of organizations, is that compliance does include the platform itself, meaning Power BI and the service, as well as how you have done the implementation of it. So talking about the platform, Microsoft, I included their logo here in the bottom, has what's called the Microsoft Trust Center. And under the compliance menu there, they've got a lot of great materials about how they've worked with some of these different bodies to make sure that the platform is compliant. So it's largely around data security, data retention, things like that. So Microsoft has worked with these organizations to ensure that the platform itself is compliant, which is good. And so I do recommend that you reference some of the materials on that site. Again, just to understand that Power BI itself, then using that will meet certain compliance requirements. But of course, if you were not entirely careful with how you deployed it, I mean, you could certainly put data out into the public that would cause problems. So there's a big aspect of how you manage that yourself internally. That's a part of this. And similar with the governance, it's really important within an organization to communicate. Everybody needs to understand that the compliance is a big issue, that it applies to everybody in the organization, and it's not something that needs to be a hassle or a burden on developers, for example. So developers should understand, okay, I'm creating this report, it needs to follow these compliance rules, et cetera. But those rules should be readily available and accessible to everybody who needs to see that. Okay, another big one, and I believe, just checking my notes here, this one was, I think, pretty high on a lot of people's list as far as one of the issues or problem areas they have as they're deploying Power BI is with architecture and using best practices in the architecture. And so this is something that can get complicated, which is why it's one of the top 10. And there are a lot of different things to consider. And most of it just kind of depends on where your organization is at and how you plan to deploy Power BI. So it's things like, understanding, first of all, I mean, are you deploying this in the cloud, or are you using the on-premises version of Power BI? That's a pretty basic starting point. A question that we get quite frequently around data modeling and importing data and creating relationships between entities and defining calculations and measures is whether it's better to do that type of work in the Power BI desktop tool, or if it's better to do that in analysis services in a tabular model, because the technology is similar, et cetera. And of course, the answer of is it better to do it here or there, it depends on your organization. There's certainly like a cost aspect of using analysis services, but that's something that does come up quite frequently as we're designing a Power BI solution. Depending upon where your source data is, you may have to manage an on-premises gateway, and that gateway is software that runs within your network that allows communication between your on-premises data center and the cloud. And so there are a lot of considerations about where that gateway should be running, who has access to it, who manages it, and as far as the architecture of it, where does it sit in relation to data sources, how much data is flowing through it, et cetera. So there's a lot of things to consider there with the gateway. Another one from an architecture perspective, thinking about the Power BI reports, is this idea that in Power BI you can import all of your source data into the Power BI model, where the data then becomes compressed and relationships are rendered and calculations are rendered, versus the idea of letting Power BI at query time live connect to your data source. So we're not importing data into Power BI, but we're just querying it each time a user clicks a filter or renders a report page. It would re-query data. And there are a lot of considerations for understanding what's a better option for your organization. Is it better to do the import? Is it better to do the live query, et cetera? And that's a big architectural consideration. A lot of variables go into that, so I don't want to go into all of the details there, but it is a big consideration and something to address early on in your deployment. And then bringing up security again, this is a big architectural decision about where and at what level in your data architecture should security be applied. And I guess here I am thinking more about the data layer of things, but then getting into the reports as well. Again, this whole idea of limiting users to only see data that they have access to. But all of these things with data security would have to be considered as you are designing your architecture. So a couple more that are pretty interesting, just really around the product itself. And of course, we understand that Power BI as a product is changing rapidly. We know that the desktop tool, the designer, is being updated just about every month. And oftentimes there are some pretty significant changes. And most of the challenge here with this pace is a bigger challenge for organizations really who are accustomed to doing their own software management. They install patches themselves. They install new versions of software themselves. They can manage deployments themselves, and it's generally on a much longer type schedule. And a lot of that is changing today, and this pace of change is really not limited to Power BI. In fact, this is something that's happening all over the cloud landscape, where software changes are deployed in the cloud, and then we as consumers of those products are just getting those updates live. And so it's something we sometimes call cloud pace. So the pace of cloud is much faster than it was in our classic on-premises software distribution environment. And one anecdote that we've heard from Microsoft, I've heard this about a couple of products, is just the way that Microsoft in particular looks at the future of their products. So thinking back to things like SQL Server, their product roadmap used to go out about 3 years. So they would know, okay, this version of SQL, we will include these features, but maybe the next version of SQL will include these features. But we understand that for some of the products now that outlook or that horizon really only goes out about 6 months. In other words, what they're planning to implement only goes out about 6 months, and then they're constantly kind of evolving the model. Certain product features become more important more quickly than they had in the past. And this is kind of a challenge, but it's more of just a challenge of change than anything for a lot of organizations. And then this is really, I guess, closely related to the pace of the product change. Whereas the product change, I was kind of referring more to like from an IT management perspective, you know, this idea of maintaining software. But what I want to talk about here is keeping up with all of the new features that are actually deployed with Power BI. And I would say that's especially true now as I'm talking to you in May of 2019. I mean, it used to be, you know, even just 2 years ago that the monthly updates of the desktop, they included a lot of enhancements to things. So for example, I can remember teaching a Power BI training course where we did not have the option to control the size of the font on an x-axis of a chart. And while I was teaching the course, the desktop update was made available, and it included, among other things, the ability to change the size of the font on the x-axis. Now that was about 2 years ago, but now we see a lot more big new features being deployed with the desktop tool. So things like the data flow activities that are available, where we can now use Power BI in the cloud to create data sets that are stored in the cloud. And now just recently we're learning more about how we can integrate machine learning into those data flows. And those are just a couple recent examples of pretty big new features that have become available. And so I guess the one suggestion we have here is that there's no need to rush to adopt all of these right away. I mean, machine learning and data flows may not be a good fit for your organization. But it is important to keep up with all the new features and just understand kind of the direction of the product. And with the new features, that's not to say that there aren't still enhancements coming. There are constantly enhancements being made to the product. And so, you know, we do encourage you to, you know, keep up with the latest version of the desktop tool for the best reporting experience for your organization. And if you're counting, this is actually the 10th of the top 10 challenges that I wanted to talk about today. And it's just this whole idea of data culture. Very often we'll meet with customers who want to deploy Power BI, and maybe we'll do a POC of it and you know, prove it out on a smaller scale, and people will see Power BI and the interactivity, and generally, you know, it's common that people want that. People are really hungry for good data. They would love the ability to be able to perform, you know, better analysis with that data, and people then of course can see the promise of predictive or advanced analytics, and people really do get a hunger for that data. So there's a genuine interest in most organizations for good data. But all those scenarios that I listed there just quite simply need good data, and that is a challenge. That yes, we want all the great analytics, we want the interactivity, but we don't have the data for it. We need good data, and I can't underestimate the importance of the fact that it does take effort. If you're in an organization that's struggling, or you're saying to yourself, gosh, we'd love to use that, but we just don't have the data, it can happen, but it takes effort. And I think that the effort is worthwhile because there's a genuine need and hunger to get that data. So that effort very often does require changes in the way things are done. So this is, you know, a time where if you start hearing things like, well, we don't do that because that's just the way we've always done it, that will likely have to change in many cases. If you have bad data and you want good data, something has to change. And very, very often, you know, where we see the most successful organizations in regard to this, that there are directives coming from the top levels of senior management. Senior management, executive level, wants to be able to see how their organization is performing. And if they can understand that that requires good data, that drive and that motivation to capture, to cleanse, whatever it may be, it really is best if that's coming from a senior or executive level, management level. And that will, with strong leadership, affect the culture of the organization to where your company or your organization can develop a data culture where things are measured more with numbers. Your applications are becoming more robust in capturing good data. And so this is a challenge that a lot of organizations have, but it's one that can be addressed. And so I wanted to include that one here as well. Those were the top 10 challenges that I wanted to talk about today. And of course, I do want to mention that these are challenges we've seen, and if you're interested, we can help you and your organization address some of these challenges. So we'd love to talk with you if you are stuck on some of these or need some help or some focus, some direction. We would be glad to talk with your organization and see what we can do to help you with your Power BI deployment. And Crystal, with that was everything that I had for today, and I'd be available to take a few questions.
All right, let me check to see if you have some questions in here. Let me see. All right, you got a few questions in here. Do you want me to read them off to you, or do you?
I'll let you pick some that you feel are appropriate.
Okay.
I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, perfect. What is the best to implement in Power BI? 1, Power BI service, or 2, Power BI report server?
Right. So that's a complicated question. A lot of the times we've seen companies make that decision kind of based on their ability to deploy to the cloud. And so some companies are still a little, they're not ready to go to the cloud yet. And so in those cases, the Power BI report server is a bit better option. And that's generally where we see that. Kind of the default motion in general is that you would deploy to the Power BI service in the cloud, unless there was some reason, kind of policy-wise, not to. Generally, that's where we've seen people use the report server on premises versus the cloud-based service.
All right, the next question is, few organizations in Pakistan are using Power BI report server, and when we compare some of the features like cloud service provides is not in report server. And if we need those features, then what do we do?
Yeah, so that's an interesting challenge. So yes, to be frank and clear, yes, the feature availability of the on-premises Power BI report server it lags behind the cloud service. Part of that is this idea of the cloud pace, right? Microsoft and other organizations can much more quickly deploy things to the cloud, whereas getting things into your on-premises environment it just requires management of that resource internally and downloading updates, et cetera, and that's just a slower process. So what can you do about that? Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer on that. I mean, but it is, just be aware that yes, there are differences. The new features will always be available in the cloud-based service, and then later on they'll be available on the report server, the on-premises tool. So yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of the nature of the way that those products work.
All right, the next question is pretty long. It says, how do organizations manage a variable demand from their business teams? For example, let's say 2 teams are heavy users all the time and all the other teams have peaks and lows. So do we plan a P2 capacity for heavy usage teams while providing P1 capacity for low usage teams?
Uh, that would be one option. The other thing to consider, if it is truly low usage, I'm not entirely sure of the entire use case here, but you may not even need premium capacity in that case. If it really is low volume usage, perhaps using the cloud service on its own without premium would be sufficient. That'd be one thing to consider there.
All right, the next question is, I'm sorry, I just lost my spot here. We got past the body. Okay, under governance, how do we manage workspaces created by staff who have transitioned out of the organization? How do we keep the workspace managed under the IT ops, let's say?
Yeah, so that does require a certain level of monitoring that, and so there are reports, I believe, available through the console that will show you the list of all the workspaces in your organization. That's something, didn't really talk about this today very much, but Pragmatic Works, we do have a Power BI managed service that will help you track some of that as far as who owns workspaces and whether or not that person has an active license. So that'd be another way to do that too, is through disabling a license. So if a person leaves the organization or moves to a new role, that their license can be turned off, and that'd be another way to do that.
All right, the next question is, how can you import when there are data size limits?
So that's a good question. So that's one of those architectural considerations. I mean, if you have a data set that's just quite frankly too large for Power BI, that maybe the import is not a good option. Another thing I would suggest there is looking at the premium capacity. With premium capacity, we can do an incremental load into the Power BI model. And when you do that, that product then does allow you to import more data than what is than what you can do in the desktop model. So there is a hard limit of what they'll let you deploy in a model that comes from desktop, but with the incremental refresh, that's going to refresh that model on the premium capacity with data that will go beyond that hard limit that you have. So that'd be something else to consider. Something else I should point out, I mean, I'm not sure of the data volume here, but just be aware that when we load data into Power BI, it is compressed. And so when we're talking about the data volume limit, we're talking about the compressed volume. So if you're pulling data from, for example, a SQL Server database, and it's 5 gigs of data, that 5 gigs of data in SQL Server will be much, much smaller when it's imported into Power BI.
All right. Let's see. I think there's a few more down here. Let's see.
Yeah, let's go with, how about 2 more?
2 more? Okay. What is the adoption of tabular models on top of transactional databases? And what are the considerations for the cost of the development, maintenance, performance, and user experience?
All right, I may have you repeat that first part, please, Crystal. I'm going to jot this down.
No, you're fine. What
Yep.
is the adoption of tabular models on the top of transactional databases? And what are the considerations for costs of the development, maintenance, performance, and user experience?
Right, so that is I think I got most of that. All good considerations. So I mean, as far as, I'll start with the last one there, user experience. One thing with your architectural considerations would be data latency. So one potential benefit of using an analysis services model on top of a transactional system, depending upon how you have it set up, is that you could have very, very, very low data latency. I don't want to say no latency, but near as close to real time as possible if you have your analysis services model on top of your transaction system. So that's a benefit that you would have to weigh. The cost there, just in pure dollars, is the cost of analysis services and building that. But you also then have to consider and just weigh this out. Again, this is an architectural consideration of, do you want reporting going live against your transactional system? Or is it better for your organization to either report on a replica, or is it better to create some type of reporting database that's refreshed occasionally with that transactional data? It's a fascinating but complicated architectural question with a lot of considerations.
All right, we'll do this last one here. Let's see. How do you manage Power BI source controls and continuous integration in PBI?
Great question. The way that I've seen this done the best is by keeping versions. So in Power BI Desktop, you can take a report and save it as a template. And the benefit of saving it as a template is that it has the complete structure and definition of your report data sets, your visualizations, your DAX formulas. It has all of that, but it does not include the data. And that's a benefit just purely from a file size standpoint. So generally speaking, if you create a template from a Power BI report, that file is going to be very, very, very small compared to the same report with all the data loaded in. So that'd be the first thing. Use templates, and then those you can put into source control and manage them. You can't really do like what I'm going to say the word diff, but a comparison generally. You can't really merge changes between versions, if you will, if there's a conflict. But you can kind of go back to a previous version, et cetera, if you use a template. Now, for the continuous deployment, that is a challenge. So you can use something like, you can do PowerShell scripting to deploy out to Power BI, but from what I understand, like, that's not a fully integrated deployment mechanism like the person is probably asking about.
Okay. Do you want to do a few more? You got about 10 more minutes here.
I'll take 2 more then, sure.
Okay.
2 more.
Okay. You got quite a bit in here, so.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I guess for the recording, if there are some questions that we didn't get to, we will try to answer them offline and follow up with a blog post with answers to some of them that we did not get to today.
Awesome. This says, we thought of going only to premium. What is the best time to go for Azure? I'm not really sure. I think that's all to the question. Yes, that is. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not. Bob, are you there?
Yeah, Crystal, can you ask that one again? Because maybe I will hear it differently if you repeat it.
Yeah, no
Otherwise,
problem.
we can move on to another one.
No problem. Let me find it again. Hold on here. It says, where were you? Okay, we thought of going only to premium. What is the best time to go for Azure? And it says with question mark.
Yeah, I will have to follow up with that person afterwards.
Okay. Does an analysis service model have to be in tabular format? Do you recommend tabular?
That's a good question. The answer is no, it doesn't have to be. You can create a multidimensional model. The reason I mentioned tabular is because if I was doing my modeling, importing data sources, et cetera, creating relationships, writing calculations, if I was doing that work in the Power BI desktop tool, the technology that's under that is basically analysis services tabular. And so it's a pretty common architectural pattern to, rather than build that or do that tabular modeling work in Power BI, to do that modeling instead in an analysis services tabular model. And so that's why I made that comparison. To be clear though, Power BI can connect and consume data from multidimensional models, and we've seen that work very well.
All right. The next question is, what is the best strategy for data governance of Power BI reports?
The best strategy for governing Power BI reports. I mean, that's I can't give a best strategy. I will say, kind of referring to the slide, I'm gonna go back to my notes here. That's the kind of thing that from an organization perspective really needs a lot of input from everybody in the organization. It also requires documentation and management of processes. And so there's no one best way to do that, certainly. But the most successful government's plans are really heavy on communication, so everybody's clear about, you know, like I talked about earlier, which data sources I should be using, you know, understanding when data is refreshed. People just need to be made aware of that through some type of communication. So, yeah, and then Crystal, if you would send me the other ones, you know, later, we can take some of those offline then.
Absolutely, not a problem. Definitely can do that. All right. Well, for everybody else, thank you so much for joining. There is another bonus webinar on Thursday, so you guys will receive the link to this this webinar's recording in your email tomorrow. But like Bob said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email him or myself. Until then, we'll see you guys Thursday. Bob, thank you so much for hosting. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.